focus here, unlike the first session with Jason, is free trade agreements, bilateral and regional rather than the WTO. Well, thanks to its, or owing to its controversial creation, NAFTA really continues to serve to this day as the touchstone for public evaluation of free trade agreements. And if you go back a decade, those who championed NAFTA generally support continuing free trade agreements, CAFTA, DR, and others, and those who opposed tend to be skeptical, not always skeptical. It varies with the free trade agreement. You don't get much opposition to, let's say, the U.S.-Bahrain agreement or U.S.-Morocco, because those are essentially political, but certainly in the CAFTA debate and to a lesser extent in the Chile debate, you had a continuation of the policy lines that were formed back in the mid-90s. Well, when it entered into force, NAFTA was a $6 trillion economy with 360 million people, and of course it's larger today. It's about a $12.5 trillion economy with 430 million people. The three economies have grown significantly in the decade. Average GDP growth in the United States was about 3.3% and a little higher for Canada. The disappointment in the decade is Mexico. Mexico does well by comparison, or has done well by comparison with several countries in Latin America, except Chile, but it's not done as well as had been hoped. It's about 2.7% over the decade. The reasons for NAFTA differed between the parties. For the United States, it was seen as a path to larger markets and as part of the very long-term response to Mexican migration. But as Phil Martin pointed out in some time ago, the pact would not realistically slow migration in the first 2 or 3 decades, and that message has become clear and evident in the subsequent decade. Now, for Mexico, NAFTA was really seen as a lock-in. Mexico had done a lot of liberalization by the time NAFTA came and started with President de la Madrid, and it was a lock-in and continuing migration, but it really dramatically cemented the reversal of Mexican policies from a statist, highly statist, as high state intervention as we had seen in Eastern Europe in the pre-Berlin Wall, fall of Berlin Wall days, to a very open and liberal economy. And for Canada, NAFTA was really just protecting what it had already gotten in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Well, of course, in the rhetoric, in the run-up to NAFTA, it was extreme on both sides, and therefore what was promised rhetorically by some politicians at the time could never have been delivered. But also the criticisms which were leveled against NAFTA were extreme, as I'm sure everyone recalls Ross Perot's statements. But today, the NAFTA critics cite an array of concerns that are, in fact, hard to dismiss. The continued high levels of immigration, which I mentioned, the slow progress in environmental reforms, and growing income disparities, especially within Mexico. Now, this would not, I think, surprise economists, but of course, the northern states have benefited in per capita and state GDP terms, and the southern states have not benefited as much, and therefore you have a spread of an already large income distribution spread in Mexico. And of course, there has been the growing trafficking in drugs, as Mexico had become a favorite port of transshipment to the United States. So those are real problems, and many of them were outside the scope of the NAFTA text. right from the beginning. In fact, nearly all of them were, but they were in public expectations, both here and to some extent, I think a lesser extent in Mexico. But if we look at the benchmark set out in the agreement by our assessment, the R is Jeff Schott and myself, NAFTA has been a success. We're critical in some dimensions, but I think as a trade agreement it has measured up. There are limits, as there always are in trade agreements. As economists have said, if you really wanted free trade, you could do it on a page. And since these agreements run to hundreds of pages, you know that there are at least many hundreds of those pages, or the great bulk of them, are carve-outs or phase-outs or limitations on free trade. And in NAFTA, the big restrictions were the rules of origin, which is a tremendous amount of text and very restrictive, Mexican energy, Pemex, and the third very much concerns this conference, free trade and agriculture. I mean, NAFTA was a pioneer in that it commits U.S. and Mexico to free trade and agriculture. It committed over a long period of time, about 15 years, for the most sensitive products. So we're now approaching, the end game in that. But that was really a signal accomplishment. Now, Canada, U.S., of course, do not have free trade in agriculture, and NAFTA did not make much progress, or hardly any progress, beyond what had been agreed in Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, which reserves poultry, dairy, and other products from the free trade obligations. We had, as you recall, the side agreements on labor and environment, which President Clinton brought in to help market NAFTA. And our assessment is that those agreements did very little to win converts, and their descendants today have not won many converts from those who oppose the free trade agreements, but they did provide the political cover for the initial NAFTA. The rhetoric of the mid-90s on trade was highly concentrated on jobs, jobs, jobs. And President Clinton was is a brilliant politician, and he said to his economic advisors at the time that that's what would sell it, and he used that to sell it. Now again, this is quite a discordance from economists, because economists do not believe that trade agreements are net job creators or net job destroyers. They do change the quality of jobs, and hopefully for the better, and we think in the U.S. case that's true, and they change the sectoral composition of jobs, but the net job numbers, which flowed very freely at the time, are a misdirection of public attention. But nevertheless, you still see that kind of arithmetic thrown out, but it's thrown out to a much lesser extent today than it was then, and that's we can be thankful for that. The peso crisis, of course, was a big blow after NAFTA was ratified, and I think the important thing of the peso crisis was not the crisis itself, because actually that was anticipated, believe it or not, or believe it, by the IMF and the World Bank. We were doing some consulting for them at the time, and it was widely anticipated that they would have a crisis. The depth was unanticipated, but their policies were pointing in that direction. But the interesting thing was the aftermath of the crisis, and of course the very large U.S. commitment. Now, there would have been a U.S. commitment in any event for good and sufficient national security and public policy reasons, but the NAFTA partnership, surely enhanced and enlarged and sped up the extent of the commitment. Trade and security. This, of course, is a post-NAFTA issue, or post-inauguration of NAFTA issue, and the U.S. has reverted to the two borders aspect as opposed to a single unified plan, and that does reflect the differences in management of the two borders. So we have two different borders. There has been improvement. I won't go into this at length, but conceptually, it's widely agreed that you don't deal with security for the most part at the border. You deal with it at the origin of goods, if we concentrate on the goods aspect, but also in terms of people, in terms of the visa procedures and so forth. And that's the concept which has been widely embraced and to a very limited extent, implemented to this day. My Canadian friends who come to the U.S., they are they're quite critical of the way the procedures are now implemented, and it's discouraging. Well, we've had a sharp expansion of regional trade, as I mentioned. Those who are interested can read the book that Phil kindly mentioned, or they could just glance through the paper. I cite some statistics, but the best econometric models are the ones that I place the most faith in, do indicate that NAFTA expanded trade to a much greater extent than would have happened in the absence of NAFTA. There would have been an expansion, obviously, economies are growing and so forth, but there was a special expansion with Mexico. Now, not with Canada. The Canada-U.S. trade leap really occurred between '89 and the mid-'90s under the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and there was not much of a further accelerated growth under NAFTA, but with Mexico there was a very distinct accelerated growth. Today, of course, Mexico is competing fairly severely with East Asia, particularly China, in a number of product areas, and our criticism would be that NAFTA, or Mexico's policies under NAFTA, which are Mexican policies, have simply not taken advantage of the proximity to the United States. I could name a number of things. I will name just one thing. It was foolish of Mexico to mirror image the U.S. on the trucking dispute. Yes, that was the benefit, and it was kind of a mercantilistic response. It's the benefit of the Mexican trucking companies and the drayage companies, and there's a whole little industry there. But it's to the great disbenefit of Mexico as a nation, not to just say, okay, the U.S., you know, you won't let our trucks go north, but we'll let your trucks come south. That would have been the right economic response for Mexico, but they didn't do it, and there are many other things that they did not do. And so they are not taking advantage nearly to the extent they could of the proximity, which is a huge competitive advantage compared to China. Agriculture is a make-or-break agreement or issue for all trade agreements, and it certainly was that for NAFTA. As I mentioned, NAFTA does not have a unified text on agriculture. Sugar, dairy, poultry are particularly difficult. There are other phase-out products. I'll touch a little bit on that, a little bit more on that at the end, but NAFTA really was a big breakthrough on agriculture with Mexico. Energy, a disappointment. Mexico is harming its economic potential very substantially by the political inability to liberalize Pemex. But again, that it was reserved in the agreement. That's a Mexican issue. Every Mexican person I've talked with, the leaders, economists, they're quite aware of it. And of course, there's a big constituency, huge number of employees in Pemex who like the situation like it is. I mean, it is hard to overstate the inefficiency of Pemex. It's basically a social welfare system, but it's got 4 times the employees it needs by the benchmarks of how you'd run an energy company with that amount of production, and it's under-exploring and on and on. Now, what about turning quickly to the CAFTA Dominican Republic agreement? 217 to 215, and the interesting on the votes, but the interesting thing is how partisan it has become. Clinton rounded up 102 Democrats for NAFTA. There were only 15 Democrats for CAFTA DR. I mean, the sharpening of this line is very strong. And of course, the nominal battleground was over labor issues first and foremost, and environmental under that. But there was an unholy alliance between particularly Florida and some East Coast agricultural producers and this labor environmental camp, which peeled off some Republicans and solidified some of the Democratic opposition. They didn't talk the agricultural issues, but they were very strong, and you all know what happened on the sugar side. There are reservations again in the pact. Again, it's the long phase out, very few accepted products is the formula in Central America. White corn is quite sensitive, and there are a couple of other products. But the labor issue got a tremendous amount of attention. Now, the labor provisions in the CAFTA go well beyond what was, or go beyond, not well beyond, but beyond what was in NAFTA, in the sense that in NAFTA there are kind of three tiers of possible labor abuses or labor issues which could be brought up, and they have different modalities of handling them, all of which lead to very little action. In terms of CAFTA, there's not that differentiation, and the dispute settlement resolution system has greater possibility of biting through arbitration and through fines, which might be as high as $15 million. And the U.S. committed some money for institutional support, both for labor and environment. Our complaint on environment in both NAFTA and CAFTA is that the amounts of money are just totally inadequate to the environmental issues. And we're not saying the U.S. should provide it all, but there should have been much greater commitment of money. Environment is expensive to do the infrastructure and so forth, the sewage, water, paving the roads and so forth and so on. And these agreements are long on paper provisions and short, very short on money provisions. But to emphasize the positive again, the CAFTA-DR agreement does have dispute settlements for both commercial and labor and environmental provisions, which are highly symmetrical, unlike NAFTA, which had a pretty separate set of tracks for labor and environment disputes. Now, turning to the free trade agreement of the Americas, it is, at this point, most people in Washington have abandoned hope for it, and maybe that's too pessimistic, or at least abandoned hope within the timeline that the Trade Promotion Authority has given us, which is until June 30th, 2007. Now, up to that date, the President can, if he gives something on June 30th or June 29th, the Congress is committed to this fast-track procedure, which is a no amendment procedure and a vote within a time certain, about 90 days. But he has to notify, the President has to notify his intent to sign the agreement 90 days before June 30th, so that takes us back to about April 30th or something like that. 60 days before, perhaps. My arithmetic may be a little off there. And that's the kind of the key date for the FTAA. And as you know, things are quite stalled in the FTAA talks. So we're not, we don't seem to be on that particular timeline. But the arithmetic on the FTAA is also very instructive. If you take NAFTA and the U.S.-Chile FTA and the CAFTA-DR, and you add in the Peruvian agreement, which has been signed, not ratified, of course, and Colombia, which is almost signed, I mean, about 90% of U.S. trade in the hemisphere is covered by these agreements. That's a very high percentage, and on investment, about 80%. So already in terms of the commercial coverage, we are either very high or, just right up there. And of course, the exceptions are Mercosur, principally Brazil, but also Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and Venezuela. And we do trade with those countries, obviously, but it's a small percentage of our trade. And that's what, FTAA finally brings. And that arithmetic leads to some conclusions, which I will come to pretty quickly. I'll skip over the difficulties that FTAA has had, and if there are questions, we could discuss those. Again, we think that the free trade agreement holds very considerable promise, and it would substantially increase trade between U.S. and we could say the holdout countries, or within the group generally. But there's a lot of objections to it, and they run over a range of issues. But easily the most difficult issue for resolving the free trade agreement of the Americas is agriculture. And here, the U.S. farm community feels a big competitor in Brazil, and those issues are tremendously hard to resolve. There are other issues as well, intellectual property, where the U.S. has objectives, anti-dumping laws, where Latin America has objectives, government procurement and services, where the U.S. has more offensive objectives, or trying to open markets to a greater extent, and there's quite a bit of resistance. But agriculture is first and foremost. There are, of course, the labor and environmental issues as well, but I think the path, at least, has been hammered out in the NAFTA and the CAFTA DR of how those issues would be handled. Well, my forecast for FTA, I'm not as pessimistic as I would say the general Washington consensus is, and I do think we will get something, though it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but I think what it will be is a FTAA which will look very much like Europe of 40 years ago. You had the common market and you had EFTA. And the EFTA of our time will be the Mercosur countries, adding in Venezuela. And the larger, stronger group will be this U.S. system. And if you take all the free trade agreements that the United States will have negotiated within a very few months, they could all be brought, in my view, with an FTAA umbrella. There's a lot of similarities. There are some differences. I think the differences could be hammered out. And that could be the FTAA as a possibility at this time, leaving open for the future 5 years from now, or perhaps longer, a joining of Mercosur into this somewhat reduced geographic scope of the FTAA. Let me wind up with just a few comments on agriculture as they've echoed through this. As I say, I don't purport to be an agricultural expert, but every economist learned something about it, and I learned, as everyone here did, about Ricardo and the corn law disputes. And I think the story is much the same today. The battle in England after the Napoleonic Wars was whether to open agriculture to the continent and reduce property values. And that was the issue which Ricardo focused on, which is that corn price isn't high because land values or land rents are high, it's the other way around. And that was a conceptual breakthrough. Well, our subsidy and protection system today, by my calculation, has embedded about $1 trillion of land values between Europe, United States, Japan, Korea, Canada. That's a lot. and that's using a very high discount rate. This can only be resolved over a long period of time and has proven extremely difficult. It was too difficult for the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, as I say, is a very big breakthrough because it promises to open up our two countries, Mexico and the United States. And there are two ingenious formulas designed to deal with this, to the transition problem, which is, as I say, just huge amounts of money on both sides of the border in these land values. One is the very long phase out, which I applaud. Now we've stretched it in NAFTA, the longest was about 15 years. In the Australia-US, we're up to about 25 years if we take our longest phase out. But that's probably about the period of time you have to realistically think about liberalizing. And the second, which hasn't been used so much, but I think is very important, are, you could say, hair trigger safeguards. It's much easier to put in safeguards on agricultural products than other products within the FTA agreement. We have, on the Institute, and it's on our website, we've looked at the possibility of a Swiss-U.S. free trade agreement, and in that context, we went back and looked at what the U.S. has done in its other free trade agreements on safeguards and phase-outs. And there's a pretty clear formula that's now been, codified in terms of products and in terms of how these apply, and I think that is the formula that works. And I think if we ever include Brazil in FTAA, or we work out an agreement that has Brazil as part of the package, that formula will be repeated, probably with some very long provisions. But I want to emphasize that these free trade agreements have gone far further in agriculture than the WTO has any possibility of going in the next decade or longer, and certainly in this round. In this round, I'm, of course, Jason, he has to be an optimist for the reason he said, but I live in a think tank world and I don't have to put on rosy glasses, and I think we're going to get a shallow result in agriculture out of the WTO. But these free trade agreements have gone much deeper, and I am optimistic that that process will continue. Next point on agriculture I'd make is that I'm surprised it hasn't happened so far, but I think it will increasingly happen, and AG's remarks in the previous session underscore this possibility, that the U.S. will become much more like Europe. In Europe, you can identify the free trade countries on agriculture, led by the UK, but there are others as well, Sweden and so forth. And you can identify the protectionists. In the U.S., it's much murkier today which are the free trade states and which are the protectionist states. But it's beginning to become clear, and I think the politics will shake out in that direction. California, at least so far, has been the leading agricultural free trade state for the reasons that AG referenced in the last session. I hope it stays that way. And when you look at the Congress, Bill Thomas, you will not find a stronger free trader, I think, than Bill Thomas in an important congressional position. Florida, of course, is on the other side of the coin, which is completely opposite to Florida's economic interests. Just as agricultural protection in France is completely opposite to France's general interests, which are in services and high-tech manufacturing. But the agricultural lobbies are very effective in capturing the political process. In any event, I expect we will see this distinction reinforced in the years ahead. And then the final remark I would make, and just emphasize something I said earlier, I do think the path to free trade in agriculture lies much more in these free trade agreements than it does in the WTO. I would like to see it in the WTO. I'm skeptical it will happen there. Thank you.
So I'm supposed to stick to a discussion of the book, NAFTA Revisited, but in light of the previous session, which was really about U.S. agriculture policy and the WTO in general, I'd like to make a couple of comments about that. The focus so far today, from what I understand it, in the audience has really been on our policies good for the United States and our policies good for U.S. agricultural growers. And while I appreciate the sentiment and I realize that I'm speaking in Sacramento, California, I would like to point out that 55% of the world today is living on less than $2 a day. So that means 55% of the billions of people today are actually technically poor by the World Bank's definition of living on less than $2 a day. And quite frankly, for those 55% of the world's people, opening up their markets to free trade is not going to solve their problems. If you're interested in a deeper assessment of that statement that I just made, I have a book that's available on my website and that's also available on the National Bureau of Economic Research's website, which you can download for free, and the book is called Globalization and Poverty. And if you read the chapters, you see that solving world poverty is a lot more about other factors other than forcing these countries to open up their markets. There was another statement made that I'd like to take issue with, which is that all economists believe in free trade. Well, that may be true at UC Davis, but I don't think it's true at UC Berkeley. And in fact, if you'll think a little bit more carefully about Jason's statements in the previous session, you'll realize that Jason doesn't believe that either, although I don't think he's here anymore. So Jason began his discussion by talking about, oh, you are here, sorry. He began his discussion by talking about what the United States really wants is a more level playing field, where what we're trying to do is let market forces take their work and allow the U.S. to sort of enter where it was. And he continued in this vein, but then by the end of his discussion, he admits in question and answer that really U.S. policy is driven by mercantilism. And believe me, mercantilism is not free trade. What mercantilism means is that you're trying to open other countries' markets for your exports, but keep your own markets closed to their imports. And that's really what's driving U.S. policy, and that's what's driven U.S. policy for the last 200 years. And that is not what is going to help the poor in the rest of the world. So I think we should be really clear about that from the very beginning. And let me just say a few more words about whether, in fact, the United States actually adheres to a level playing field. The United States, if you look at the U.S. in the last 200 years, has had among the highest tariff rates in the world. Our average tariffs were over 50%, which is higher than any other developed country until the end of World War II. The reason we lowered our tariffs then was so we could get into other countries' markets, not because of any belief in the intrinsic benefits to the United States of free trade at home. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that we do not have a level playing field for agriculture. We passed a farm bill in D.C. which raises U.S. farm subsidies to the highest level in the history of the United States. We spend about $1 billion a year on farm subsidies in both direct and indirect ways. This is pretty much the highest in the world, second only to the European Union. So we are subsidizing our farm exports, and yet we want other countries to open up their markets to our goods, and those are subsidized goods. So I think we have to be honest about that. So that's sort of a long beginning or prologue to what I'm supposed to talk about, which is Gary's book. And I'd like to say that I really like Gary's book. It was an excellent opportunity to read his book, and he has a very balanced view of the benefits of NAFTA. As he points out, it couldn't possibly have achieved what the optimists expected, but nor did it lead to what the pessimists had forecast. So I personally am old enough to remember what Ross Perot had to say. Remember, I don't know if you all remember, but he said that NAFTA would be a giant sucking sound that would lead U.S. jobs to go south, right? We would suck all those jobs southwards. And that was one of the big pessimists, obviously. And clearly that hasn't happened. So I think this is quite balanced. As Gary points out, clearly not all the goals of NAFTA have been met, but he claims that the assessment is generally positive. And I would like to commend his book for being what he calls a nuanced view, and I'm particularly sympathetic to his point at the end of the book where he says that he realizes is not a very attractive view, that you can't reduce his book to a quote-unquote simplistic soundbite, and I think that's really wonderful that he's resisting, the sort of the lure of these simplistic soundbites. However, in net, Gary's the book gives a fairly positive evaluation of the success of NAFTA, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to learn that I think maybe the assessment is too positive. And I think it's too positive with respect to three important issues. One, he claims that clearly NAFTA has been good because we see big increases in trade flows between Mexico and the United States. Number two, he claims positive labor market effects in both the United States and Mexico. And number three, the book even claims that, in fact, poverty in Mexico has declined as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it turns out, if you look at the data closely, not in this book, that in fact poverty in Mexico, if anything, has increased. And so what I'll be doing now is looking at the gains from Mexico's perspective. And just to sort of give you a brief assessment of where I think the data lies, is that the United States, in fact, which was the more fearful one about this agreement, has on net not been hurt, in fact, probably gained. However, the country where you see big costs in terms of the poor and the workers are Mexico. Mexico is the one that should have had somebody standing up talking about the giant sucking sound, and all the workers, in fact, are moving to the United States, not the United States. So let me talk about that. So what many have claimed, and there's that statement in this book, and you see President Vicente Fox of Mexico making the same claim, is that NAFTA was a success because you see big increases in the volume of trade between Mexico and the United States, and that's certainly true. So the volume of trade between Mexico and the United States has at least doubled, if not more, whereas trade between Mexico and the U.S., for Mexico and the U.S. with other countries, has not increased as much. But a standard economist assessment of gain is not whether there are big increases in trade, but whether, in fact, if welfare went up. And by welfare, economists mean that you can buy more goods more cheaply from the right producers. So simply looking at whether there's an increase in trade between the trade partners doesn't tell us anything about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And in order to make an assessment about whether that increase in trade is good, you need to look at whether, in fact, what's going on is whether, in fact, trade is being diverted from other exporters to these regions who could have provided those goods more cheaply. And there's no real analysis about that in the book. So again, I'm just spouting out about increases in volumes doesn't really tell us anything about welfare. So now I want to focus more on Mexico. I think it's really important to focus on Mexico, where most of the poverty in these three countries lies, and even though I'm trying to encourage you to think about Mexican welfare just for the sake of the Mexicans, we can even think about this in a selfish sense, in the sense that the poorer that Mexico is, the more we need to deal with migration problems in the United States. So let me just talk about what happened to Mexican jobs and Mexican poverty. If you look at Gary's book on page 45, wages in Mexico have fallen in real terms. They haven't even maintained inflation. Immediately following the passage of NAFTA, real wages in Mexico went down 10%. 10 percentage points, that's a really big decline. And 10 years later, they haven't recovered. They're barely back to where they were 10 years ago. At the same time, productivity of those workers increased dramatically. This is also from Gary's book, so if you look at page 45, the productivity of those workers went up 25 percentage points. So their wages went down, their productivity went up. What does that tell us? That tells us that Mexican labor is not sharing in the gains from whatever NAFTA may have brought, despite the fact that they're more productive than they were 10 years ago. So that, to me, is a huge concern. What about Mexican poverty? And really, I really like Gary's book. This is the only point where I really would take issue with the book, and this is on page 52 if you happen to have the book or if you're interested in reading the book. So the analysis says that poverty fell in Mexico from 42.5% of the people living on less than $2 a day in 1995 to 26% in the year 2000. I have no idea where these numbers came from. If you go to the World Bank's website and you download the official poverty statistics, which is where most analysts who are concerned about poverty go, what you will see is that poverty in Mexico either stayed the same or increased. So, for example, $2 a day, 1989, 25% of the Mexicans were living on less than $2 a day. By the year 2000, that number had gone up. Okay, so by the official standards, poverty actually went up. So I think they should issue an erratum or something, because this is very misleading. This gloomy picture from Mexico has been confirmed by others. I would encourage you to read Gordon Hansen's chapter in this book that I'm putting out, that I mentioned, that's on my website or the NBR's website. Gordon Hansen has another gloomy assessment of what's happened in Mexico. Finally, there's a very interesting discussion in Huffbauer's book on what happened to the Mexican corn farmers. U.S. exports of both white and yellow corn to Mexico have increased 20-fold. That's 2,000%, although I'm not good in math. So this is a really big increase. And the question is, what has this done to Mexicans poor? Most of the poor in Mexico are in the rural areas. Most of the farmers produce corn. But I will actually hold off on answering that or discussing that, because I understand that Alex Peterson-Swaney, a colleague of mine at Berkeley, who has written a paper on this topic for my book, is going to discuss this in more detail. So just to summarize, I think it's a very nice book. It's extremely balanced, which is wonderful, because I think the tide in Washington is turning against the so-called Washington consensus in favor of reform, open. However, I think it's in some respects, it's too optimistic. So that concludes my remarks.
Well, one of the things we've already heard about at this conference is how borders are not really as open as they seem, even with the free trade agreement between U.S. and Canada. Agriculture is left out. Between U.S. and Mexico, we'll be hearing about some specific commodities. And that actually reminds me of a joke about a Dutch farmer. And I'm from Dutch background myself, so I'm only poking fun at myself here. And this Dutch farmer built a stone wall on his property, and this wall was as thick as it was tall. And when his neighbor said, "Why did you build that wall as thick as it is tall?" he says, "Well, if the wind blows it over, it's still tall enough." So maybe that's what the border is like, a little bit. Well, in my remarks, I'd also like to compliment Gary on his book and his paper. There's a lot there to dig into, and I've only really begun. But it's a really good piece of work, and one that'll keep us reading for quite some time. In my remarks, I'd actually like to not talk directly about his book or his paper, but just talk about one aspect of NAFTA and free trade areas in general that academics have picked up on lately, kind of a new aspect that deserves our attention. And it's an aspect that Secretary AG referred to this morning when he talked about product differentiation. And he was speaking of California and the importance of product differentiation in agriculture, giving us hopefully the opportunity to export new product or new product varieties. And this is a topic that has not been lost on academics, and in fact is a very hot area of research. How do you measure new trade in new product varieties? So rather than doing more of the same, let's think about doing something new, something different, and trying to export that. So there is actually quite interesting work these days on exactly that topic. I won't really be speaking of US or California exports here. I'll be focusing on Mexican exports to the US or worldwide, either one, and comparing that a little bit with Chinese exports, just to give us an interesting comparison case. China, of course, is now a member of the WTO, and I'll argue has experienced a rather pronounced increase in product variety of its exports, as has Mexico. So this is the topic I'd like to talk about. If I could compare with Anne's comments, this gives us one possible silver lining to NAFTA or to other free trade areas because of the large-scale tariff reductions. Rather than one product at a time, when you cut across the board, it does allow countries to come in with new varieties of exports, right? And that is a potential important source of gains from trade. Okay, so I did have a PowerPoint prepared. There's a handout out there. I'd invite you to pick that up if you don't have it already. I will refer to it a little bit as I go through my discussion here. So I've already tried to motivate why new product varieties are important. I think they're an important source of the gains from trade, either static gains from trade or even dynamic gains from trade. And furthermore, the research, existing research by academics has shown that tariff reductions, especially widespread tariff reductions like we get in free trade areas, do allow for new product varieties to start being exported. I could just cite a couple of papers. Authors Kehoe and Rule have a paper looking specifically at NAFTA. They do something kind of interesting. They line up products, think now about Mexican to US exports. Let's line up products by the products that were exported the least before NAFTA. Right? So we sort of line them up in a line and put the products that are exported the least first, and then say, where on this line do we see the biggest percentage increases in trade? And it turns out way disproportionately, the biggest percentage increases in trade is exactly in those products that were exported the least. Right? So that already gives you an indication. The potential gains here is not from doing more of the same, right? Potential gains is from moving into new product areas, and that's indeed what's happened for Mexico-US trade. I've also done some work on this, just to cite you a couple of numbers here. With my own co-author, Hiao Qi, who's a student at Davis, now at the World Bank, we've looked at export variety from a number of countries and tried to relate that to differences in country productivity. So in the big picture, do we think that when California agriculture can export more product varieties, it's more productive? Probably so. And now let's jump from there. When countries in general can export more product varieties, right, due to the ability to market those products abroad, are they more productive? Probably so. Can this actually explain the huge, massive differences in productivity across countries that we see in the world today? Well, if you really look at those differences in productivity across countries, they are so huge that our conclusion is that export variety only explains a really tiny portion of those differences in productivity, only actually about 2% of the differences in cross-country productivity. But that's a really hard test to explain differences in cross-country productivity, Africa versus the US. And economists have a hard time dealing with that. What about if we change the question and we say, within a country, let's look at growth in productivity over time. To what extent, on average, is that growth in productivity over time of countries correlated or explained by increases in export variety? And there we do quite a bit better in the sample of countries we look at. We conclude 13% of the growth and productivity of countries over time is actually explained by improvements in export productivity. So this is an important driver for these countries, an important driver of productivity growth. And furthermore, we find that these improvements in product variety are definitely related to tariffs, that you're facing tariff reductions that you can enjoy in your export markets. Okay, so let me cite you a few numbers specifically on Mexico's export variety and how that's grown over time. This is from page 5 of my handout, if you happen to have it. Why don't we start with agriculture, which isn't really the focus of our study, but is certainly included among other sectors. That started in 1990, 4 years before NAFTA. We give a number for Mexico's export variety to the U.S. in agriculture of 60. Think of that as 60%. So how exactly do we calculate that number? Well, what we do in agriculture, we'll look at the range of products that Mexico sells to the U.S. Okay, so imagine having the very disaggregate trade statistics. Look at the range of products. Now, we don't look at how much Mexico actually sells in those products. We're going to look at worldwide sales to the U.S. within those products that Mexico exports. Okay, so it's like a pure measure of product variety in Mexico, right? Look at worldwide sales to the U.S. in those products and just divide that by total worldwide sales to the U.S. in all agriculture products. So that's that number, 60%. Okay, 60% of agricultural exports to the U.S. are coming in products that Mexico exports in. Okay, Mexico isn't exporting necessarily that full 60%, somebody is, but it's in products where Mexico has an appearance, right, has a share. Okay, so that's kind of, I hope you followed that example a little bit. It's a pure measure of export variety, product differentiation. Okay, that number actually grew from 60% to 70% from 1990 to 2001, or a growth of about 1.5% a year. So there actually is fairly significant growth in the range of products. Again, this is growth in the range of products that Mexico's exporting. That 1.5% per year, what's that exceeded by? Which sector? Turns out in our analysis it's only exceeded by one sector, and that's wood and paper, where the growth rate for Mexico is higher. Other sectors like machinery and transport has a relatively low growth rate in product variety over this period. Doesn't mean it's not exporting more of the same of what it was exporting before, right? But its growth rate of product variety was lower. Same in textiles. It was already exporting a very wide range of textile products, and the growth in textiles a little lower, 1.1% was the growth in the range of textile exports being exported from Mexico. Okay, so just to give you a summary statistic, if you look over the whole range of Mexican exports, and we say what was the increase in that whole range, the average is roughly around somewhat less than 1.5% per year in terms of the growth in export variety over all products. Okay, and that was between 1990 and 2001. How does that compare to another country? Well, let's compare it to China. China is a recent entrant in the World Trade Organization, certainly enjoyed most favored nation access to the U.S. market even before that, right? But joining the WTO was a way to lock in that access to the U.S. market as well as access to other countries' markets. What has this done to product variety in exports from China? Okay, well, to the U.S. So why don't we start in agriculture? Where was China in 1990 in agriculture, right? In their exports to the U.S. Remember, I already said, according to our analysis, Mexico's export variety to the U.S. was 60%, right? 60% of all U.S. exports were coming from a product where Mexico had some share. Okay, how about for China in 1990? That number is 40%. So much, much lower. In 1990, China was just not present in many of the agricultural products that the U.S. imports. What about in 2001? A decade later, it was 50%. So we went from 40 to 50%, so a growth rate of about 2% a year. So in fact, China's growth in product variety in agriculture exceeds that of Mexico over this period. That also happens in a number of other industries. In machinery and transport equipment, right, which obviously includes a tremendous number of different manufactured products, China's growth rate of product variety was actually 6% per year over this period. So it went from product variety of about 38% to 73%. So a huge, massive increase in the range of products that China was exporting. In electronics, the growth rate was 1.9%. In textiles, it was much lower because China already had a big presence in that sector even in 1990. So if we now say, okay, what about, let's jump ahead, 2001, okay? Who's leading in 2001 on China versus Mexico? China has in fact surpassed Mexico in export variety in 4 of our sectors: textiles and garments, electronics, wood and papers, mining and metals. Mexico still leads in terms of product variety in 3 sectors: agriculture, machinery and transport equipment, and petroleum and plastic products. Okay, so let me conclude then by just commenting briefly on the specific impact of NAFTA. So far my comparison was US-China over an entire decade. What could we say specifically about the NAFTA impact on product variety, right? So that's the 1994 impact, okay? If you look at the years before 94 and the years after 94, try and correlate product variety and exports with the tariff reductions, what do you find? We find that overall export variety from Mexico to the U.S. increased by 6.5% from 1994 to 2001, so a substantial growth in product varieties. We conclude that definitely is due to NAFTA in most sectors. What's the sector where we really can't find much of a NAFTA impact? Agriculture. Right? And the reason for that would be specifically the very slow phase-in that Gary referred to of tariff reductions. Okay? Not much of a specific impact in NAFTA. Product variety from Mexico is growing over that entire decade, but we just can't specifically attribute that to NAFTA tariff reductions, right? And again, the slow phase-in is the key there. So just to conclude, we have seen in this past decade and a half, a substantial increase in Mexico's export variety to the U.S., especially since NAFTA went into effect. China generally, in 1990, started with less product variety of exports in many sectors than Mexico, but has overtaken Mexico in a number of sectors. This expansion in export variety is, we think, a driver of productivity growth, both in China and in Mexico. So this offsets hopefully a little bit some of the concerns that Anne expressed, the fair concerns that Anne expressed about NAFTA. It's also an important source of consumer gains in the U.S. There's some other work that tries to measure consumer gains in the U.S. due to new product varieties coming in, and they are very substantial. Those consumer gains probably exceed the gains due to just sort of conventional consumer gains that one might measure. Thanks very much.